So they're looking out the window and there's a broken bottle on the sidewalk. Sign says Center for the Study of Viral Pathology, and the caption says, uh-oh. So we just talked about viruses. That would probably be an uh-oh. There is some question as to whether COVID originated in a lab in China. And I know it sounds like a conspiracy theory and an anti-Chinese thing. There is some possibility of that happening, is that those particular coronaviruses were being studied in a building just a couple of blocks from this market that the first cases arose at. But people were bringing bats from the infected, they were studying the bat viruses in the building, they were bringing bats into the market from other places. So it wasn't on purpose, and if it was accidental, I don't think whoever did it really meant it to happen. But you know, as some conspiracy theories, you go, oh, there's no chance at all. That conspiracy theory, wasn't really a conspiracy theory, except that maybe they covered it up. It's possible. One other thing I meant to mention about viruses, most of the time, if you're told you have a stomach virus, you have food poisoning. There are a couple of viruses that can survive the protein unraveling effect of the acid in your stomach, but very, very few. So there's not a lot of honest to goodness stomach or intestinal viruses in the world. There are a couple, you can run into some, but most of the time, it's kind of gotten customary for the doctors to tell you it's a stomach bug or stomach flu or stomach virus, because they know if they tell you you probably have food poisoning, that you try to figure out where it came from. And as you'll find from a lab that we do later in the semester, there's about 45 different things it could be if you have food poisoning, some of which would have been your last meal, some of which might have been 2 days ago. So easier for them to go, we can't treat a virus, you got a virus, go home and wait it out. Anyway. Now we're coming up in the world. Bacteria. Bacteria are honest to goodness cells. They are different from our cells. Our cells have chambers in them with membranes around them, like our nucleus, and there's a bunch of other ones too. We talked about organelles, and you've got organelle lists in your handout. Bacteria, they don't have those internal chambers. Their DNA is in kind of a special area, but it isn't sealed off the way that our DNA is sealed off in a nucleus, which makes processing it a lot more efficient. Bacterial cells are way smaller than our cells. That's why when we do the lab, I only make you find and draw one, and all you can really do is draw the shape that you can see under the microscope. In our cells, you can see stuff inside the cells. So they're very small. There's way more of them than there are of us. Somebody once calculated that we have more bacterial cells on and in our body than we have body cells. Since then, people have kind of thrown some shade on that math, but the idea is, when people read it, it's like, oh yeah, that could happen, because we have lots of bacteria that live on us and in us. We'll talk about that as we go through this section. And out in the world, if you put all the bacteria on one side of a big balance, and put all the other living things, so all of the humans and whales and trees and flowers and funguses and all the other living things that are not bacterial cells, that have our kind of cells, on the other side of the balance, the bacteria would outweigh us. So there's not only more of them, there's more mass of them. They kind of, it's their world, we're just kind of sitting in it. Most bacteria are perfectly benign. They have their roles in nature. They do a lot of very, very important things. They're some of our major recycling agents, and they just live out there. There's lots of them just, happily living in the environment. We are not an ecosystem that's friendly to them. So there's just a handful, compared to all the many millions of species of bacteria, just a handful that can use us as an ecosystem. Some of which do it and kind of get along with us perfectly fine. As I said, we have a whole bunch of species, probably a couple thousand species of bacteria that live on us and in us. Some of them can hurt us, but the ones that live in us long term either are not really doing anything to us, or they're actually helpful. So you don't want to When you take an antibiotic, most of the time the side effects you get are because antibiotics are bacterial poisons. They poison chemistry that bacteria do that we don't. But it also poisons our little buddy bacteria. That's why antibiotics often cause intestinal issues, because that's where a lot of our friends are. But most antibiotics don't affect us because the chemistry they're going after isn't something that our cells do, just bacteria do. There's a bunch of different ways to tell bacteria apart. In terms of human diseases, there's a couple of categories based on whether they do take up or don't take up a particular type of stain. The stain was developed by Dr. Graham, who I think worked in Long Island. And again, it's a chemistry difference between the bacteria. There's a whole bunch of bacteria that are gram positive, a whole bunch of bacteria that are gram negative. But they have certain characteristics that they kind of sort of have in common. Other things that distinguish them are shape. Is that where if you're trying to figure out in a lab what you've got, now they've got some pretty fast DNA tests, but it used to be, if you had an infection, they wanted to know what they were dealing with, they had to take it to a lab and put it on a bunch of different plates of different types of nutrient solutions and see what it did there. So it might take a couple of days for them to go, this is this bacterium or this is that bacterium that you're dealing with. Gram positive, gram negative, you can come up with fairly quickly. So we're talking about a bunch of different species. Gram negative as a group are more uniform. They tend to have a lot of the same stuff that they do, the same chemistry, which tends to make them susceptible to when we come up with things that will poison one type of okay, I think I've got this backwards. I just looked at it. Oh no, I don't. It's backwards on the screen. It screws me up sometimes. So gram negative tend to, once you come up with something that'll poison one species, it will tend to work on a bunch of other ones. Is gram negative, they tend to be more different from one another. And that gets us to the second thing. Good old susceptible, that's a great word. Both to antibiotics, that are things that we give people, and antiseptics, which are things that we use to treat surfaces. So antibiotics tend to, if it works on one, it tends to work on a bunch of them. If you have an antibiotic that works on a gram positive, it may work on a couple of other species, but then there's going to be a whole bunch of species it doesn't work on. Antiseptics, depending on the antiseptic, don't work as well on gram positive bacteria. They tend to brush it off a little bit more. These guys are a little bit rarer in the world, except for places where there's a lot of this stuff. If you go into a hospital where a lot of people have been given antibiotics and a lot of antiseptics have been used on surfaces, then you're going to find a population of bacteria that skews toward the gram positives. And if some of these can cause diseases, infections, then you can pick up an infection in a hospital that's very difficult to treat because they don't react to the normal stuff. And it even can be difficult to figure out what exactly you got because the tests for these are not necessarily as rapid. It's what they call a nosocomial infection, an infection picked up in a health facility. And the reason that happens, people go into the hospital with one thing, and then they develop this mystery infection and they don't do so well. It's because of the nature of these beasts, really. I already mentioned antibiotics. Anti-living things. Usually when people talk about antibiotics, they're specifically talking about chemicals that affect bacteria. But because the term is more general than that, sometimes they'll also use it for things that affect funguses or protozoans. It's one of those rules that should have a particular meaning, but the meaning shifts depending on who's talking. But funguses are alive too, protozoans are alive too, so it's not technically wrong to call those antibiotics. But usually antibiotics are specifically antibacterials. And you'll hear the word antibacterials occasionally. Those are usually not for drug purposes. Those are more for like soaps and things that can kill bacteria. A lot of our antibiotics come from other living things who are in competition with bacteria or themselves need to fight off bacterial infections. Typically, penicillin, the cyclins, a lot of things come from either other types of bacteria that are competing with bacteria for food, or funguses which are competing with bacteria for food. Penicillin comes from a type of mold. And so they make penicillin. They don't care that we're going to use it to fight bacteria. They do it for themselves. And that's typically what you're looking for, is that a lot of animals that don't have our type of really complex immune system actually have antibiotics that circulate in their blood. And those are tricky to make antibiotics for us out of because those tend to be big molecules. And we tend to develop antibodies to them, and it makes us allergic pretty quickly. So you don't want, we can develop allergies to other types of antibiotics. They're like penicillin, people develop allergies to penicillin and to other of the antibiotics, but it's rarer. The antibiotic, when they've tried to derive antibiotics from things like frogs and fish and stuff, the allergy issues tend to keep it from ever getting onto the market. So, I want to mention this. So, used to be when I was a kid, you'd go into your doctor and your doctor would go, you have a viral infection, we can't really do anything about it, here's a shot of penicillin. And you'd go, you can't do anything about it, why am I getting a shot of penicillin? And they go, well, the virus infection reduces your resistance, or reduces, yeah, they said resistance. And just in case, this will keep you from getting a bacterial infection. There was no real evidence that viruses do that. There really isn't any evidence that virus infections do that. And it really was, here's a treatment, it's a shot, feel like I've done something for you, come back when you feel bad again. And at that point, doctors weren't expensive, the shots weren't expensive, it wasn't really a way of, I mean, they made some money on it, but it probably wasn't for money-making purposes. And nobody figured that it mattered. Even when people discovered that when you change conditions around the bacteria, you are actually sorting through for antibiotic-resistant strains, mutants, that can survive in the presence of penicillin. Nobody figured that mattered because you didn't have a bacterial infection. But here's what happens. Remember the side effects? These also are being picked up by your own native population of bacteria, who also are now being pushed to develop a resistant strain. If there's a mutant-resistant strain in your body, you've wiped out the other ones, and now they're the ones that are propagating. So now you have a resistant strain. And then you go, but it's friendly. What does it matter? Bacteria do a weird thing. They package up individual codes or collections of codes into these little DNA loops called plasmids. And they share them, kind of indiscriminately. So it is possible that later on, you could pick up a legitimate disease bacterium, and one of your buddies will go up to him and go, I got this cool plasmid. It really helped us survive a while ago. You want some? And they'll share this antibiotic-resistant variant, this different code, and now the new dangerous intruder is resistant. They didn't have to be evolved to it. It's a great thing. It produces variations in bacteria that they don't naturally produce themselves, so it's good evolutionary strategy, but it's not so good for us. And so that's why if you have a viral infection, you should not be getting a shot of antibiotic. They don't like to do that anymore. They're not supposed to do that anymore. And it's a weird multi-step thing that can produce from your own bacteria an antibiotics-resistant strain in bad bacteria. here's a term you're going to run into in various places because it's become a really big deal. The microbiome is the population of living things that lives on and in other larger living things. Usually not parasites, although sometimes the microbiome has some fairly nasty species in it. But it tends to be the normal resident population. We've known for many, 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 many decades that our colons are full of bacteria. So much so that what comes out your back end is about 1/4 bacteria. So they're always, making more, but they mix in. And we've known for a while that some of those bacteria do good things for us. When you take in something that has vitamin K in it, it actually doesn't have that molecule. It has a molecule that your resident bacteria change into vitamin K, the useful form. And so they do that for you. They mobilize some minerals that don't like to dissolve in water. They mobilize them so they'll go into your blood. And so we knew nutritionally there were some good things for the microbiome. We've discovered in the last 20 years or so that these guys do some really odd things. The ones that get up on the edges, right? Your intestine is hollow, it's full of these guys, but there's tissue edge. And you have white blood cells that wander through the mucus and the tissues, and bacteria get up and interact with your immune system and help train them so that your immune system learns how to fight bad bacteria from your good bacteria, and sometimes how to fight viruses, it looks like. And sometimes the mistake gets made and they attack your own tissues, and they think that some, what they call autoimmune diseases, where your immune system's going after yourself, have to do with a weird mix of bacteria in your microbiome. And there's even things like they call fecal transplants, where they clear somebody's whole colon out and then implant a mixture of bacteria. Used to be they just put feces from somebody else in, but now they have a way to do it with spores. And hope that it'll produce a new population that doesn't have the same interaction with you to produce the bad immune response. And it seems to work. It's pretty preliminary stuff, but it seems to work. And they think that this might involve more distant relationships in your body, even in how your brain works. So it's a really big area of research, but it's kind of still somewhat in its infancy, where we don't really know. And other microbiomes, like the microbiome of your skin, they're just starting to really try to figure out what's going on there. And the microbiome of the vagina is that there's been a few studies going on saying that a normal vaginal birth may deposit useful microbiome bacteria on the baby while it's born that it doesn't get through cesarean section. And maybe that is going to have an effect later on. Is that so far the studies have been indecisive or indeterminate, but could be going on. Sorry, something occurred to me a second ago and it's flown out of my brain. That happens when you get to be my age. Probably happens at your age too. But so all bacteria are not bad bacteria, and some of them are good, and some of them are good only under some conditions. I don't want to put it on the list here, it's in my notes, but I do want to talk about plagues, big outbreaks of diseases, pandemics. We don't call them plagues anymore. And most of the plagues in history have been a mixture of viruses and bacteria. And we talked about disease evolution and how it kind of cooks in these particular societies with a whole bunch of large population centers that you can get to from one to another fairly easily. And for just to repeat it, is that was why when the European explorers went off into the New World, they carried diseases that tended to be very bad for the populations out there, but they didn't really bring any back because the New World didn't have that kind of societal setup. They didn't cook these diseases and cook a population of resistant humans the way that the European system did and the Asian system did. Although the Asians didn't do a lot of exploring through ships and boats and stuff, so they didn't wind up with quite this. Although our European plagues often came from Asia, is that the classic plague originated in Asia and came to Europe from a somewhat resistant population to a naive population. It is possible, they're still trying to figure this one out, that one disease that may have come back with the explorers may have been syphilis. Syphilis is an unusual disease in that it's very, very slow acting. And so it can be carried back on a boat and not wiped out everybody on the boat in the process. And it can, because it's very slow acting, it can move amongst a population that's more spread out, like you had in the Americas. There's some studies that say that syphilis didn't really appear until the 1500s and 1600s in Europe, and some studies that go, no, it was there longer than that. But nobody's quite been able to agree one way or another on that particular issue. Okay, that's it for bacteria.